So a couple of weeks ago, I had the honor to talk to a group of people in Vallejo about the water efficient landscape ordinance, and it was hosted by the CLCA, the California Landscape Contractors Association. So I've had several people give me some emails and heads up asking me if I could share my slides or if there was some way to see the presentation again. And I thought, sure, why not? Let's record this so that it can get out to more people. The water efficient landscape ordinance is extremely important to me. I think it is a big part of the solution in California for healing our planet and saving our resources. So let's go ahead and dig in. We've got the introduction to the soil food web, which is a huge topic. I mean, that's a 3 hour or 4 day talk for that matter by itself. And then we've got our two sections that have to do with the soils and the requirements for the water efficient landscape ordinance in order to be in compliance. So we've got section 492.5, which is the soil management report. And then we've got section 492.6, which has to do with the design that you submit. And I'm just going to talk about the soil components of that. There's a lot more to the design and elements that have to be included in that. I'm just going to go through the soils and everything related to soils in terms of the WELO, the Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance. I think what I'm going to do though is swap this up, and I'm going to take care of the compliance part first, and then get into the intro to soil food web later. That's really the fun part. So let's dig in here. All right, 492.5. Right, this is the soil management report, and the whole point of this, the intent, is to reduce runoff and encourage healthy plant growth. Reducing runoff is kind of a no-brainer. That's wasted water, but it's also pollution. There's a huge amount of salts and fertilizers and many times even toxic pesticides that wash into our waterways and get into our groundwater and our streams due to what's commonly called urban drool. So what we've got to do here, and then of course, yeah, healthy plant growth. That you need healthy soils to have healthy plants. Sure, one could argue that, oh, but hydroponics has nothing to do with soil, and we can grow healthy plants without soil. Partially true, but really to get peak health for plants, it's part of a whole ecology, and it's much more important to look at the whole web as one entity. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what it takes really to have a good soil ecology. And then we'll get into that soils report and how to take samples, send it into a lab, and analyze what you get back. So first off, let's look at what I'd like to call the soil ecology triangle. And I like to compare it to the fire triangle, where, in order to have fire, right, you need three things. You need to have a spark or some kind of ignition source, you need oxygen, and you need a fuel. You put all those things together, bam, you got fire. So the triangle for soils and soil ecology would be to have organisms, have a habitat, which also includes oxygen, and then also have some foods for them to live on. And what's nice about the WELO, the Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, is that this is a really holistic, comprehensive plan that includes compost and mulch. And when you set up a system with compost and mulch, what you're doing is you're mimicking the natural O-horizon, the layer of the soil, to have nutrient cycling where there's all those three things there. You've got organisms, you've got habitat, and you've got food. So by applying compost, you're really getting that triad. So let's look at taking soil samples and sending it off to a lab. What you want to do is get your soil probe or a spade. You want to scrape off the top growth, and then get that thing down into what would be a representative sample of the site. And then have a Ziploc baggie or a bucket, a nice clean bucket, not a galvanized one, not a certainly not a lead one. The Ziploc baggies work great. I like to use the refrigerated or the freezer ones because they're a little tougher, and then a Sharpie marker so that you can write on there right away where you got the sample from. So a representative sample on most sites would probably be maybe 10 or 15 soil plugs. And what you do is you go in there, depending on whether you're doing perennials or trees, you might go 6 to 8 inches deep to a foot deep. Pull that up and then take off the top organic debris, pull out any roots, any rocks, any bugs, worms, insects, anything like that, so that all you're really getting is the soil itself, and put that into that bag. And then mix it all up, and what you want to do is get at least 2 cups. 2 cups is a good sample for a soil lab. And if you have varying different soils on the site, you might consider sending in 2 samples. Go ahead and make 2 representative samples, meaning multiple little mini samples, and then putting it together so you got a nice homogeneous bag full of soil for a lab test. So then you have to fill out the form, right, that is going to explain to the folks doing this analysis what you need to know. And so this list here is essentially what you legally need to put in to be in compliance with the Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance. And I'm going to go through each of these in detail. So the soil texture, the infiltration rate, the pH, the total soluble salts, the sodium, the percent organic matter, and then recommendations. And I would like to think or hope that most people would ask for organic recommendations. Even if you don't use it, it's a good idea to understand what you could do to get that soil up to speed organically. So here's a great example of a form, right? And so you want to provide project specifications, right? And then also make sure you're getting the analysis. This one has got it so that you can say, yeah, this is for new planting. And is it from the site soil? Is it from a stockpile? From how deep did you get it? Or is this maintenance or existing landscape? Usually the WELO, the Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, is it's going to occur when you get a permit, either for a fairly large renovation or a new landscape. So I would say generally this would be for new planting. And then down there on the bottom you can see where it says prefer only organic fertilizers, and that's a really nice way because they'll usually tell you anyway the synthetic way, but that's a good one. So complete needs to include, again, texture, nutrients, salinity, pH, and here's a big one, organic matter content. Many times, unless you specify that you want organic matter content, they won't do it. So there's several different labs you can go to. Here's a great one at Waypoint. They actually have one that is for the WELO, and and you can ask for organic or bay-friendly recommendations. So that's really nice that they have stepped up and said, okay, we know folks are having to do these reports for WELO compliance. And they're even prompting folks to be bay-friendly and organic. So that's fantastic. So let's just go through those different things that they're going to tell you. And just a short explanation. I'm not going to get too in-depth. But it's important to understand, first off, what the difference is between texture and structure when it comes to soils. The textural class is very specific. and it has absolutely nothing to do with the component of the soil per se, or the organic matter. It has everything to do with size, right? So you've got three different sizes of soil textural elements. You've got sand, silt, and clay, right? And as you can see here by this chart, clay is anything less than 2/1000ths of a millimeter, which is so small you cannot see it. It's so small that they are usually in suspension as a colloid in water, and they take a long time, if ever, to settle out. So sand, silt, and clay are going to give you those three components. Again, I want to stress all the organic matter in the world is not going to change the texture of your soil. That is just the relative percentages of sand, silt, and clay, and it has only to do with the size of the particles. So think about this in terms of what we would consider the jar test, where you add some water, you dump in some soil, you shake it up, and you let it settle out. If you've got a sandy soil, you're going to see it settle out quite rapidly, and you'll see all the sand at the bottom. If it looks like you've got kind of three layers of even components, then you've got what's called loam. And loam is that kind of magical spot right in the middle of the soil triangle where it's got even amounts of sand, silt, and clay particles. If you have a really clay soil, you may not see much settle out at all, in that a lot of it is going to be in suspension for a very long time. So here we've got the soil triangle. You've probably seen this before many times. And then you see also there in the middle is what we'd call that loam area. And I say it's kind of magical, and I'll get to that in a minute. It has to do with available water. Plants, some plants like clay soils, some plants like sandy soils. Depending on the plants that you're putting on a site, ideally they would have co-evolved in a particular soil textural class. So there's not any one perfect soil textural class for all plants, because plants vary in what they prefer. But like I said, the loam is nice because you get more available water, and it's easier to provide soil structure. So soil structure is the idea that you take the soil particles that make up the texture and you bind them together into aggregates. These are also called PEDs. And there's this wonderful word I like. It's called pedogenesis. So pedogenesis is where you're putting sand, silt, and clay together into aggregates. And the more aggregation you get, the more oxygen you can get into the soil. It makes sense. Think of the jar with a bunch of balls in it. The larger the marbles or balls, the more airspace you've got in between, the more pore space. And the more pore space you've got, you have faster infiltration rates, larger water holding capacity, the oxygen can get deeper, so then you've got a deeper root zone, then the plants can have more nutrients, healthier plants. It's just a win-win if you can create soil structure. So look at this pie chart down below, where you can see that in a healthy soil that's not too compacted, you've actually got about half mineral particles. Those are those sand, silt, and clays. And then you've got about half of air and water, right? Those are the soil pore spaces. And then you've got a little bit of organic matter and hopefully some organisms. If you don't have organisms, all you've got is dirt. So this is a couple of images just showing how the sand, silt, and clay can hold together into aggregates or PEDs. And then you can see how when these PEDs are up against each other, they're going to create all these nice little hiding spots for the organisms and create that habitat for them to thrive. You see in that picture of that tray, right? We've got two different appearing substances. It's actually the same, right? but one has soil structure. The other one, the soil structure, has been totally destroyed. So, okay, let's move on to infiltration rates. I had just talked about how important it is to um, aggregate your soils so that you can have faster infiltration rates. And that's especially important with our landscape soils, trying to avoid anaerobic conditions that are not good for plants. So infiltration rate has to do really primarily with the texture. And there are charts you can just look up that you can get the infiltration rate for a particular soil texture at different slopes. But it's going to vary dramatically depending on the cover. In other words, what kind of, if you've got mulch or plants growing on there, what kind of plants, the compaction. If you've got enough compaction and there's no soil structure, you're not going to have very fast infiltration rate, even with a sandy soil. And then moisture content. Now, usually infiltration rates will be taken at what's called field capacity, where the gravity has leached out as much water as it's going to, and the soil is just holding on to the residual soil in the soil pore spaces. So here's just a simple chart that shows for the different soil textures at different slopes what you're probably going to see in terms of inches per hour, your infiltration rate. This is a great chart. This is not a soil textural chart. This is an infiltration rate. But it shows, the percent clay, silt, and sand. So it's giving you those soil textures. But it's showing you roughly what the infiltration rate is in inches per hour. And it's anywhere from, 1/100th of an inch in an hour up to 5 inches in an hour. So if you've got real sandy soil, you're going to have a really fast infiltration rate. Again, depending on slope, compaction, cover, those elements. All right, now this is where I was saying that there is kind of that magical spot where you've got more available water. You can see there right between loam and silty loam, the difference between the wilting point, right? The wilting point is where the soil particles hold on to water so strongly the plant roots can't get it. And then field capacity, which again is the gravity sucking the water down that the soil's not holding on to. So you can see that right there in that loamy spot, we've got the most available water for the plants. Okay, pH. This is, the negative log of the percent of hydrogen ions. pH is really important, and it's fairly easy to adjust. So it's good to know if your pH is off the charts, either too high or too low. A low pH is going to be acidic. A high pH is going to be alkali. It's on a range from 1 to 14. 7 is dead in the middle. It's at 0. That's neutral. All right. Why is this important? Plant nutrients are available to differing degrees with different pHs. A good example of that would be iron. So if you look at this little chart here, the width of these bands actually describe the availability of each of those nutrients. And you can see as you get a higher pH or more alkali, the iron becomes less available to the plants. Why is this? Because at higher pHs in a more alkali condition, the iron binds up with the calcium in the soil, and so it's no longer available. You can have a ton of iron there, but it's held up in the soil, not available to the plants. Similarly, you can see that the phosphorus in a low pH becomes less and less available. And phosphorus is it's a macronutrient, and it's what gives the plants the energy in terms of being able to go about their internal processes. You might remember ATP, adenosine triphosphate, in the Krebs cycle and how that runs everything with respiration and everything else. So not good to have an extreme of either side unless you're growing plants that have evolved to grow in these extreme environments. There are lots of plants that love alkali environments. There's even more plants that love low pH environments. Think about all the woodland plants. Um, that's important. So looking at soluble salts. Now this is kind of interesting in that one could say, yes, salt is bad for soil. Too much salt, not good. Nothing lives. Uh, think about the old preservatives, right? You would add salt to things to preserve them so that the microorganisms couldn't grow on your food. Um, Fertilizer is a salt. All the nutrients in plants are salts. So salts are not bad. It's just which ones and how much. Um, the total salts in a soil are measured by electrical conductivity because the more salt you've got in a soil, the better electrons can pass through that through electricity, and that's an easy way to see how much salt is in your soils. I guess really quickly I might throw out this little thing about osmosis. Remember that osmosis is the flow of water, right, through a semi-permeable membrane from an area of lesser concentration of salts to greater concentrations of salts, because it's going to try and create an equilibrium on the two sides of that membrane. And so what happens is if you have too much salts in your soil solution, in those soil pore spaces, it can literally suck the water out of the plant roots. As the plant roots, those cell membranes are there, and there's water in there. So if you get too much salt on the outside of the cells, they're going to get water sucked out of it. Just to really hammer this home, all these nutrients are essentially salts. And I'm going to digress here for another minute because look at the top of this chart here. We've got carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, right? And it says non-fertilizer. So we are carbon-based organisms. When you look at a giant redwood, a tree, pick your favorite plant, most of what you're looking at there are hydrocarbons, hydrogen, carbon. Where does that come from? Does it come from the soil? Nope. Right? Carbon comes from the air. That's CO2. And we talk about CO2 being bad in the atmosphere, and certainly too much of it is, and that's a whole nother talk. But when plants take in carbon dioxide as they photosynthesize, right, they are sequestering that carbon. Where does the hydrogen come from? How about the oxygen? That's water, H2O, right? Hydrogen and oxygen. So when you look at plants, you're really talking about air and water. And then we get all these little nutrients. You look the difference here, right? 89% of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then the next highest thing, nitrogen, the big macronutrient, only 4%. Anyway, food for thought. So the other thing to look at in these salts, these ions, is that we've got in their chemical name here, we've got negatives and positives, right? So negative macronutrients or micronutrients, positive. And this is very important because clay, right, that textural component of the soil that holds on to the nutrients, these ions, is negatively charged. So they hold on to cations. If something is an anion, a negatively charged particle, it's going to leach down with gravity in the water. But the cations can be held by clay particles. Now, one of the magical things about soil organic matter is that it holds both cations and anions. So if you've got a lot of compost in your soil, you can actually hold more of those um, anions from leaching, which is very important because NO3, right? Um, that is one of the main causes of algae growth and eutrophication in some of our water sources. Anyways, quick referral here, or back up and look again at salts being good, ions all over the place. We got positive and negative ones. But the one that can really cause trouble is sodium. And look here, right? Okay, we've got 0.03% of Na, sodium. So that is your table salt, essentially. And that can cause trouble. So that's another thing. Um, Clay, as I mentioned, is negatively charged. It's the smallest particle. Remember, 2/1000ths of a millimeter, really super small. And yet, on that really micron scale, there's layers. And these layers help hold all those cations. And it's a huge protected surface area, just huge. They say that a gram of clay actually has the equivalent surface area of roughly a football field, which is hard to imagine, but that's the spot where a lot of cations can be exchanged and held there away from being leached away. And that brings us to cation exchange capacity. So if you have high CEC, or cation exchange capacity, that means you can have a lot of nutrients held in that soil and exchanged in the water for the plants. So how can we increase CEC? Right? We can increase the clay, which is really hard to do because that takes lots of dump trucks and wheelbarrows. Or we can increase the amount of organic matter, or we can increase the pH. So adding compost is a pretty easy way to do that. So I mentioned that sodium can be a problem, and so what you're going to be looking at on the soil report is the sodium absorption ratio, or the SAR. And I'm not going to go into how this is derived. It's a little involved, but in essence, the lower the number there, the better in terms of having less sodium. Remember, plants need some sodium, but not very much. Greater than 9, not so good. All right, so you're shooting for a low number of SAR. And I would say that's especially important if you know your site's being irrigated with reclaimed water, because that is going to add even more salts, usually, to the soil solution. So here's where we get to OM, organic soil management, and how important compost is, because remembering that triangle, right? The fire triangle and the soil ecology triangle, you're adding the organisms, the food, and the habitat all at once, and it's a magical thing. It doesn't take, it's not very hard to look at a soil sample and determine roughly how much soil organic matter content there is. Just look at these three. One has very little organic matter, and the other one on the other side has quite a bit. And it's readily apparent when you're digging in soil how much there is. However, you still want to ask on the lab how much exactly, because they're going to be able to not just qualitatively, but quantitatively give you a percentage. So here's an example of a lab report that came back. It's got 3 samples, A, B, and C. A and B were 2 different representative samples from the same site because they were a little different. And then C was essentially an area that had already been amended and mulched, and we wanted to see what that final outcome looked like in terms of available nutrients and all the other components. But here you can see that it went from 0.8 or 0.7%, so less than 1% organic matter, up to 13%. So with the Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, if you've got more than 6%, you don't have to do anything in terms of adding more. Otherwise, there's some prescriptive amounts that you can add and some specs you can put in your designs that will easily comply with the ordinance to bring the organic matter up. Why? So that we can have the food, the organisms, and the habitat, and right, a higher CEC, more available nutrients. We can create petogenesis, have faster infiltration rates, less runoff, higher water holding capacity, healthier plants. Disease resistance, everything just goes much better when we got this working right. So again, where on this chart are you going to look at these things? So here we've got the pH, right? This chart says it's a 7.1, right? So it's essentially neutral, slightly alkali. So depending on the plants that you're putting in there, that's pretty good. Right, we've got soluble salts, 1.2. The SAR is 4.2. That might be a little high, but it's not that bad. It's pretty low. That's good. Oh, here, and the textural class. This is important, right? So we've got sandy clay loam. So again, all right, sandy clay loam, but it's still in the loam, in the middle of that triangle. So we're going to have pretty good water, available water, which is nice. Now this is the most important part of your soils report, and you got to remember to ask for the analysis and the recommendations. So as part of the analysis here, right here, the SAR, that shows sodium adequately balanced by soluble calcium and magnesium. It shows that, here we go, the sandy clay with the amount of organic matter present is moderate, okay. And we've got the estimated infiltration rate of 0.29 inches per hour. Right now, they say that it may vary due to potential differences in compaction, right? So again, slope, cover, compaction, all those things can change the infiltration rate. But given this soil textural class, you're looking at about 1/3 of an inch per hour. So down there under recommendations, they're telling you, and because we asked for California native plants and organic fertilizers, they're telling us that we can put 5 pounds of blood meal and 10 pounds of feather meal per 1,000 square feet. So it's really nice to get a recommendation of organic-based fertilizers. Interesting, though, that you can also ask for maintenance recommendations. And here they're talking about some extra feather meal, but here, under red here, alternatively, nutrient-rich composted green waste may be spread on a 1 to 2 inch layer, which generally carries enough nutrition to boost overall nutrient levels. So that's kind of the golden rule here. Is 2 inches of compost solves almost everything. And it's recommending here 3 cubic yards of composted green waste per 1,000 square feet. So now, okay, compost. I got to bring up the point that not all compost is the same. In fact, almost every yard is going to be different. You want to try and get the best compost that you can find and get it from a reputable source. Somewhere that has the seal of the U.S. Composting Council would be really nice. And you can ask to say, do you have a test results of the compost? And that is really nice because you can see if there's any pathogens, and they test it for germination, so you can see if their weed seeds are going to come up. So that's a good one. All right, let me digress here just for a second. This is interesting in that there's an app for that, right? If you're wondering about the soil of your sites, you can go onto the soil food web, or the soil web, I should say, and you can look up the series of your soil. If you go to Soil Web, get on the map, find your site, and then figure out what series it is, and then delve a little deeper into there. There's a little bit of vocabulary to get past, but essentially it's going to tell you what the pH is, what the organic matter is, what the soil textural class is, and it'll do it in maybe 5 or more layers or horizons as you go down through the soil profile. And it'll generally also tell you where bedrock is, which might be handy. All right, so compliance. You've got your soil report. In order to comply with the WELO, it has to be presented to professionals preparing the plans in a timely manner in order to make adjustments. Pretty basic. Makes common sense to me. So then when you're all done, right, then you have to verify that you actually hit the minimums here in terms of following the recommendations. And an easy way to do that is to save your receipts. You know your square footage, you know how many yards. You can do follow-up reports with the soils showing the percent of organic matter. You can take photos. You just have to have some way to verify that, yes, we got these recommendations, we followed them, we're in compliance. And you sign the form and off it goes. All right, now this gets to 492.6, the landscape design plan. So there's a couple of things here, but just to think about the intent. A landscape design plan meeting the following design criteria shall be submitted: soil preparation, mulch and amendments, compacted soils. That's the big one, right? So, and here's the term they use: transform to a friable condition. So what does that mean? It means they want you to open up that soil, right? It doesn't mean you have to go through and cultivate the whole thing. It just means you got to decompact it, right? And soil amendments incorporated according to the amendment, the recommendations, and what is appropriate for the plants selected. So it's nice that they threw that in there. You know, I mean, if you're planting a swamp or a marsh, they're going to have different soil that's appropriate for them than a woodland plant. So here's just some ideas of how to decompact a site. There's my favorite, the good old demo hammer with the spade bit, or some kind of spike or a soil rake. So again, we're just taking compaction, and this is especially important on commercial sites that have had the soils compacted to an engineering degree, which is great for roads and signposts and lampposts and foundations, horrible for plants. So make sure you spec that decompaction should occur within the root zone of the proposed plants, and then make sure it actually happens on site. Also, a side note, try not to compact the stuff during construction, right? If you've got cement trucks showing up on site, that can really compact your soils. You might even consider taking the topsoil and putting it in a stockpile and then bringing it back later after the construction is done, and protect those soils from compaction by putting down mulch or sometimes geotextiles or plywood. So here we go. This is essentially the compliance part for compost and mulch, right? So compost at a rate of a minimum of 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet, incorporated into a depth of 6 inches. So here's where they say, okay, the 6% organic matter are exempt. Also, if it's too steep, or if you're sheet mulching, or if there are tree roots in the way, you don't have to cultivate that in. Obviously, part of the reason of sheet mulching is to do that layer on top and compost turf in place, for an example. So again, 6% organic matter, you don't have to worry about it. Otherwise, you're putting 4 yards per 1,000 square feet, which is about an inch and 2/3 deep. Most specs just say 2 inches of compost, then you know you've got enough, no worries. Mulch, 3 inches minimum. That's easy. You just put 3 inches of an organic wood chip mulch on to a depth of 3 inches in all planting areas. Now there is an exemption though. They allow you up to 5% of the site to be set aside as designated habitat, primarily for our ground-dwelling native bees. So they don't like to live in 3 inches of compost mulch, and so it's nice if you can set aside a little area. However, if you do that, you must specify it on the plan and where it is. So that 3 inches of mulch, that's roughly 9¼ yards, or almost 9 and let's say 10 yards per 1,000 square feet. Will give you plenty of mulch. So again, we're going to look at what our intent here is. We're trying to mimic the natural O horizon that's in the soils. That's that layer that's above the topsoil. So you've got your duff layer of your organic matter, that's your mulch, and then you've got that that's been broken down, that's your compost layer. And we're trying, if we can recreate that, then you can set up nutrient cycling in the plants, and it works fantastic. So why? It increases water holding capacity, right? Up to 25,000 gallons more water per acre. And it can reduce irrigation with the mulch by 70%. All right, so if you can reduce irrigation by 70% and you can increase the water holding capacity, there's lots of great whys right there for saving water and having healthier plants. Reducing the soil temperatures are getting more important as we look at climate change. All right, so I'm going to skip over. Here we go. Compost blankets. Well, let's go back. So stabilizing mulching products can be used on slopes. So remember I said that the rule is essentially to incorporate the compost into the top 6 to 8 inches. But what we can do for steep slopes is just put on a compost blanket, right? That meet current engineering standards. And current engineering standards, a good way to look at that would be to look at Caltrans. Here's a great example of applying a compost blanket on a steep, rocky slope. It's been shown to actually hold slopes better than a lot of soil fabrics. So on the plan, you have to identify the type and application depth of the mulch and identify the soil amendments, type, and quantity, right? And hopefully, if you've got turf on that site, you're going to be sheet mulching. Look at those guys. 2 cows. So here we go. We got 2 cows. Think for a moment about yourself, right? You are an ecology. Inside of you, you have organisms that are helping to fight off diseases, helping you to digest, keeping you alive. It's like having another organ. And they say that if they took all those organisms out of you and put it together, you'd have about another 3-pound organism. Amazing to think that the DNA of those organisms is actually more than your personal DNA by like a 9-to-1 margin. So for soils, if you look at an acre and you took all of the organisms that are keeping that acre of soil alive and healthy, that would equal the mass of roughly 2 cows. And it's a lot of organisms. So in a teaspoon, right, a gram, the weight of an average paperclip, we've got up to 3 billion bacteria, a million protozoa, 500 nematodes, and literally miles of fungal hyphae, which is amazing in itself. But when you look at the diversity, that's where things get crazy. 75,000 species of bacteria. Now, most of which we have no idea what their purpose is, but most of them are doing something as part of the soil food web. And that's why they call it a web, is there's all these connections between all these thousands of different species that have co-evolved to keep soils alive and to make plants healthy and combat disease. To understand how this works, it's a good idea to look at soil succession. So soil succession, if you were to look at bedrock, right, ancient soil where there's no A horizon yet, and then the weathering and the rain and the freeze and thaw start to break that up, and you start to get a sandy, gravelly soil. Okay, that's going to be bacterial in nature. So the only organisms that can really live in that early sandy soil are bacteria, and they're going to have a very high pH. So then the early responders come in. We call them weeds. These are plants that have evolved over time to have seeds that can live a very long time and be viable. And they have roots that can penetrate down into these harder, disturbed and compacted early soils. And they usually are annuals for the most part. A lot of them are legumes that can fix atmospheric nitrogen. And then they also have hundreds or thousands of seeds so that they grow and die very quickly. And as they grow and die and grow and die and grow and die, they build up an organic matter that then gets eaten. Right? That's a food source for saprophytic or decaying fungi. So the saprophytic fungi come in, and this process continues, and the pH starts to go down a little bit, and it starts to trend from bacterially dominant to fungally dominant. And then you start to get some biennials, some woody plants. The soil profile starts to get deeper, and this continues until you get into your climax ecosystem, where you've got extremely deep soils, highly fungal, low pH, essentially a woodland garden. So that's your typical soil succession, and these different zones are called trophic levels. So think about the plants you're proposing for your site. Think about the plant community that would naturally grow on that site, and you've got a good target point for what successional trophic level you're aiming for and how much organic matter it's going to have and where it is on that continuum of bacterial to fungally dominant soil ecologies. Now this is the one that gets people all excited, gets me excited, and that is that, for years people thought that, plants only absorb nutrients in certain little components, certain nutrients, and they don't absorb much else other than water. Now we know that's totally not true, that with the help of other kinds of fungi that we'll get to in a minute, they can absorb very complex compounds and other forms of nutrients. In addition to that, like 40 or 45% of the plant's energy that went into photosynthesis are pumped out of the plant through the roots. So the plant roots don't just suck stuff up, they pump out all kinds of things to feed the soil ecology and to regulate it, and in some cases sequester quite a bit of carbon. So people have been studying now plant root exudates and realizing that, my gosh, here's a list of 133 compounds, and there's more being discovered all the time. Some of these compounds are made to bring in certain bacteria, to attract certain nematodes, to discourage other bacteria, on and on. There's all these different things that these things do. So protozoa, right? These are the little things that move around in the soil. Zoa, right? I like the zoo. You've got your amoebae, your flagellates, and your ciliates, generally. Um, and if you look at a sample of compost or soil under a microscope, you can see whether or not you've got these organisms, usually at about a 500x magnification. And I tell you what, the more the merrier generally. And then you've got, as I mentioned, miles of fungal hyphae, right? Fungus is extremely important, both for breaking down organic matter to create humus and humic acids and fulvic acids, but perhaps even more importantly are the endomycorrhizal and ectomycorrhizal fungi, because these have a symbiotic relationship with plants where just as the name would suggest, the endomycorrhizal fungi actually live in the plant roots and send their hyphae out to gather nutrients and water that they exchange for sugars in the plant, and help the plant grow and fight off disease. And they also sequester a huge amount of carbon into the soil. And all this happens right there in what we call the rhizosphere, that area right around the roots of the plants. Nematodes. Nematodes are essentially microscopic worms, and they're the ones that travel around and, for the most part, feed on the bacteria. And the nematodes and the protozoa eating the bacteria are what gives plants most of their nutrients. When we talk about nutrient cycling, that's really what it is. It's the waste that is resulting from nematodes and protozoa eating bacteria. So nematodes are classified by their mouth parts. They've got fungal feeding, bacterial feeding, plant pathogenic feeding, meaning that you've probably heard of the root knot nematode in tomatoes, good example, and then predaceous, where they'll actually eat each other. So they're all ID'd again by their mouth parts, and their mouth parts are pretty cool. You can see ones that are nice and soft that might be for lapping up bacteria. Others are quite vicious looking that might be predaceous or plant pathogenic. So then let's think again about that O horizon, right? We've got that compost layer and then the mulch layer, right? That upper layer. So the way that the mulch turns into compost is with these guys, these microarthropods. These are the shredders and chippers, the mineralizers. This picture here that shows all those little mites, right? So that is taken from a square foot of forest area, 2 inches deep. So note it says it's not 200 mites, it's 200 species of mites, right? So it's an innumerable amount of mites in a healthy O horizon, along with the springtails and other microarthropods that are breaking down that mulch layer, creating that humus, and then that is being brought down into the soil many times by these guys. So the earthworms can process up to 10 tons of debris per year, per acre. That's crazy. And if you've heard a lot about worm castings, what is in a worm casting is much more nutritious and available than what they ate. So they actually improve upon the nutrition and availability of nutrients as they eat and process the soil and the organisms. So the other big why of adding compost and mulch and trying to mimic nature like this is to sequester carbon, because we can greatly reduce our atmospheric CO2 if we practice regenerative landscape practices and we incorporate organic matter. We want to finish the loop of our recycling process and maintain that 3 inches of mulch over the soil and let the soil organisms do their job. And it's going to really go a long way towards combating climate change. So I'm going to close with this picture. I love this. You can see, just as the Freeman rode the worms in dune, there's a little bacteria riding a nematode as he's cruising through the soil. And so nematodes are a great way for someone like a bacteria to get around. Uh, Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you on the next one. Please send me any comments or questions. Thank you for listening.